Hello and welcome back to Parley, my on-the-spot responses to the prompts you folks submit. This one is from EyePatchNotes, hope you'll enjoy listening. It's options this similar or dissimilar from the Toram Online series. Continuing from last time, EyePatchNotes begins. Toram Online has quite a few ways to halve the next skill's MP cost. Magic Impact is the most straightforward and arguably least finicky. It's 200 mana and it's got a 24-meter range, so what are some of the other ways? Yes, in this game you can string together sets of abilities to create combos that are one button, so you can just set up in the game an interface that lets you basically stick together, glue together, 5-6 different skills. We talked in previous Parley about this game that you get a little bonus for doing so. This is a great example of my old adage that the game is the behavior the game rewards. This is not just a convenience you could use, even though you are allowed not to use it, I would imagine, because the game actually gives you stronger skills if you combo them together. Not just because it's easy to follow one skill with the other if you press one button and it does both skills in a row, but because the game actually grants you additional little bonus modifiers, tags, that can apply to, I forget exactly because it's been a while since this Parley, but I think it's every skill after the first in the combo. So you pick a skill to open the combo with. That might give you some bonuses anyway. Magic Impact is an attack, it's got good range, and then your next thing doesn't cost as much mana. You might already want to use something else after that, and by putting them together in a little macro combo, you also get to add a bonus tag like more damage, or there's lots of things like it executes faster, the animation is quicker on the second and following skills. So making big long combos is involved. Obviously that means there's going to be a lot of skills that when you use this, the next skill gets this benefit, right? Or maybe even a detriment or both. So there are a lot of other next skill costs half mana skills in this game. And this is a delightful little example of this thing in game design where oftentimes there's a lot of really similar options. And I think this is one of the places where a game's build system is the most clearly evaluated. Are the really similar options just a total oversight and there's really no reason for these to exist and the developers were desperate for design space? Or are there very clear different benefits and detriments to each? And do they feel like they have coherent opportunity cost or power budgeting? We'll talk about both those concepts more. Let's just look at the options. There's something in the halberd tree called Deadly Spear, 100 mana, one-handed sword and halberd only, slow to cast, so the animation speed is slow, it takes a while to complete. It's got increased crit rate, it halves the mana cost of the next skill if this skill crits, and it inflicts physical proration. Don't worry, we're getting to proration, that's the other half of this Parley. But as you can see, there's a lot of little modifiers in here that could be things that would make you want to use this over Magic Impact. It costs less mana. It has more crit rate, so if you're already built into crits. It is conditional, so if you don't feel built into crits, then it doesn't guarantee you actually do have the mana cost. Another subtle distinction we'll get into a little later is that this has to actually hit to actually crit to have the mana cost, whereas Magic Impact doesn't actually have to hit to have the next move's mana cost, which might seem like a small distinction, but again, a reason why you'd use this over that. And then the physical proration, just put a pin in everything. Every time proration comes up, just put a pin in it. We're never going to not need to put a pin in proration. So let's pinration. In it? That doesn't really work. Next one, the Night Tree has something called Rage Sword. 200 mana again, one-handed sword and two-handed sword only. Halves the mana cost of the next skill. If you have aggro, very interesting one. So that's the enemy is focused on you. I gather that this one needs to hit as well, or like your target needs to be targeting you, basically. So if you and an ally are there and the enemy is facing them and you use this, it doesn't have the next skill's mana cost. But as long as they're facing you or attacking you, great. If you're solo, happy days. They probably are. And again, it inflicts physical proration, double put a pin in it. Blade Tree has Swift Attack, 300 mana, one-handed and two-handed swords only, halves the mana cost of the next skill, no qualifier, it just does, inflicts normal attack proration. So you can see that this one is more of a direct competitor to Magic Impact, where you just do it and it halves the cost of the next skill. This one, however, is 300 mana and is restricted to what weapons can use it, whereas Magic Impact is, I believe, not restricted. and it's also ranged. Magic impact's damage as a range attack. So what's the point of that? That proration pin is trying to jump out, but we're not going to talk about it. Oh wait, actually, yes, but proration, EyePatchNotes continues, is Toram Online's batshit but fascinating way of incentivizing multiple damage types, and as you can see, incentivizing different abilities. There's not a huge difference between a lot of these, except their mana costs, what they're available on, and the proration. So what is that? Hitting an enemy with normal attacks makes magic and physical attacks deal more damage, and it makes normal attacks deal less damage, specifically, not just relative to the other ones. If you hit an enemy with a normal attack that inflicts normal attack proration, put a pin in that as well. I know that sounds like you wouldn't need to clarify that, but you do. That does 100 damage. It's a normal attack, it inflicts normal attack proration. My understanding of this convoluted system is, if you were to use that attack again, you would do less than 100 damage, like 90. And also, you would have further increased the magic or physical attack damage that your next attacks will do if they do that kind of damage, up to a cap. And you said in the little follow-up video that the lower limit is about half damage, or like 25% or 50% less damage, and the upper limit is like about double damage. So a lot, right? A very substantial amount. The game is the behavior the game rewards. The game definitely heavily rewards switching your damage types, or so I would say, but it really means switching your proration types. Just keep putting pins in the wall in that same spot, right on top of each other. Repeat this for the full triangle, and we can see something interesting. One-handed swords have access to no fewer than 4 different methods to halve the next skill's mana cost. Magic impact, and then if you remember, Deadly Spear was halberd and one-handed sword only, Rage Sword, one-handed and two-handed sword only, and Swift Attack is one-handed and two-handed sword only. Magic impact works for everything, so you have a lot. Each of these skills has their pros and cons. If the Parley author can be taken at face value for a moment, absolutely, this is convoluted enough, you can handwave a little. The blade tree itself is biased toward physical damage. This makes Deadly Spear and Rage Sword, which inflict physical proration, somewhat self-defeating if the player's preferred damage-dealing skill comes from the blade tree. And yet, the blade tree's very own Swift Attack comes with normal proration, making the other two moot. Right? I will attempt to explain what this means, because I think I know how it works and why it matters, but it's weird. Yeah, if you get these skills in a talent tree, imagine the one-handed sword ability or talent tree, however it works in this game, and it's full of abilities that give physical proration, well, then, yeah, they make the next skill's mana cost lower, but it better be lower because it's not going to do any damage. You just depleted the physical proration, so now the enemy's not going to take as much physical damage. You want to do a high damage, high cost physical skill. You want to reduce that skill's mana cost. So you put a skill before it that halves the mana cost of the skill. But 2 of those skills, Deadly Spear and Rage Sword, themselves inflict physical proration, so they will also make your high cost skill, which now has its mana cost halved, great, do less damage. Boo! What's the point of that? Right? Now, I can immediately think of a few, like, unless there's a reason I'm missing, you could do something like Deadly Spear, which is the cheapest one in mana cost to begin with. Magic Impact, you reduce the Magic Impact's cost, and then that also halves the cost of the next one, which is then your big physical damage you wanted to do. You could chain them into each other to an extent. And by separating away the ones that do physical proration, you could minimize the detriment of that, I would imagine. It doesn't seem great, though, because I would imagine these are not all like the most amazing damaging skills. And also Deadly Spear is slow to cast, so you're lowering your damage output as a whole, as long as you could have maintained your mana. But you can probably see where this is going, right? There is some niche to having these skills, and therefore it makes sense that we can see a bunch of differences between them. For example, Swift Attack, which inflicted normal attack proration. Well, now it makes sense why that one is more mana. And it's unconditional too, so that's really good. It just halves the cost of the next skill, and it doesn't inflict physical proration, so your next big physical skill you want to do is going to do big damage. So it comes at the cost of having a high mana cost. Great. Again, as I was kind of snidely saying earlier, it's very clear once you investigate this if the system was designed by someone who was thinking about these things or not, or if it just like blatantly flies in the face of all this stuff. That is very clear, at least from Swift Attack and Deadly Spear and Rage Sword and Magic Impact. Somebody really thought about this topic while making these, and I think you'll find if you analyze most games, they did not. But yeah, what could be the other thing? Well, the first notable benefit, EyePatchNotes continues, is flexibility. A Toram combo, player-defined skill macro, cannot have two instances of the same skill, so you can't spam something within a combo. And furthermore, a skill can only be used as an opener once. The game will automatically toggle a combo off if the player makes multiple combos that start with the same skill. So you can save them, but in a given combat, you can only use one. Having multiple mana-having skills means a given combo can contain two of them, or two distinct openers with similar effects. Right, so basically the answer here is you might just want different avenues of attack, and you cannot begin a combo with the same skill more than once, more or less. And so even if a skill it was just straight up worse in every way than another skill that halved your mana, you would sometimes want access to that, or it would still be significant to have that exist in the game. You might decide you don't want to use it, but having it be that the game says, hey, you want to have a skill's mana cost, right? Here's a really good way to do that. And the player goes, great, great, love that. I'm going to make this really strong combo around it. But if there's some reason why I don't always want to spam that combo, I would like a little bit more. And the game says, okay, well, you just use the best one, but here's another one. It's not as good, maybe, but you said you really wanted it, so will you still take this deal? And the player might go, well, I don't know, right? Let's say yes. And then the game goes, I've got two more. They're progressively worse than each other, but like, you seems like you really wanted this. Maybe we made mana very tight in this game, right? Do you still want to pay the cost for this? And the player gets to choose. And I think this is broadly good, as long as the amount of options for the player to kind of peter out their desire for the thing is long enough that there are options that the player like has to think about this. Basically, there's more than one skill that reduces your mana cost, but also not so long that it's just stupid. You know, I don't think you need to make 7 of these just because you don't want only 1 or 2 of them. You see what I mean? That doesn't really make sense for there to exist. I mean, it would be kind of interesting actually, but it would be weird if there was like 15 of them. You see what I mean? We want the player to eventually not take the deal, but it would be weird if we let that go on for eternity. The game is like way too fixated on this, I think. So very cool that there is a runway of sorts. I'm calling that concept I don't know, a decision runway for this type of game design element. And it's of like moderate length. You know, there's 4. Great. Cool. I feel like that totally makes sense to me. So yeah, to rehash, having multiple MB having skills means a given combo can contain 2 of them or 2 distinct openers with similar effects. It can be emphasized that next skill used gets X, is a recurring design space too. Like there are a lot of other things in the game that say the next skill's mana cost is halved, or like something else. The next skill does more damage or has faster animation speed. Within the blade tree, 2 notable specimens are Trigger Slash, that increases animation speed to its cap, so the next move will go faster basically, and Aura Blade that multiplies damage. These 2 skills mirror the effects of the Swift combo tag and the Smite combo tag, respectively, the little bonuses you get to add to skills for putting them into a combo. Man, did this game reward making combos enough? Jeez, like every single mechanic in this entire game is just like, please use the combos, please. And I don't know how to feel about that. In a lot of games, you know, a lot of AAA development is built around the idea that the player might just never pick any upgrade. And it is very, very bad for balancing your video game that is meant to have interesting difficulty if you have to build the game around assuming the player blatantly doesn't use a system that they're given. Of course, and we won't get into it too much here, part of the reason that happens is because a lot of these games have bolted on a build system that doesn't actually fit the game's intended design space for some misguided marketing reason. And so could it be that that was why the player doesn't want to make a decision? Anyway, but the fact remains, a lot of AAA games, not specifically, but I call out that space enough anyway. I'm just using it as shorthand for overly marketed, underdeveloped games, which is not really entirely fair, but I'm explaining my bias. overly marketed, underdeveloped games uh, often do this thing where they will have a build system, but it's arguable the game isn't really trying to be about making choices. They just kind of wanted to advertise it that way. And as a result, a lot of players won't want to engage with the game's build system. The game isn't really about making build choices. And often the behavior these games reward is ignoring the build choices and making the one choice that the game was more designed around, basically, because it's not designed for you to make a variety of choices. It's designed for you to make one choice, and then the build system is there just in case you just don't like that choice, but you bought the game because of its marketing hype, because that's the only reason to buy the game, and then you just don't like the thing that the game is actually about. Not to call the obvious one out, but Assassin's Creed games have like 3 skill trees, which are assassinating, and then melee and ranged. And it's like, wait, but hold on though. The game is called Assassin's Creed. You can make a game called Assassin's Creed that is about brawling in the open, but you can't make a game called Assassin's Creed about brawling in the open and then make there be an assassination tree. You can make 3 separate games, one of which is about assassinating, one of which is about brawling in the open, and one of which is about, I guess, sniping people with arrows from afar, but in the open, and then put all of those games in the same game. But let's just say I don't feel they did that, and so if you play these games, there will be one of those trees where you're like, yeah, okay, this is like the game, and then these other ones are like, if you bought this but you don't want to play this game, you can do this instead. It's worse though. It's a worse experience, not necessarily less powerful. It's a worse experience, but it's just in there. Whereas, from that perspective, you can see how a game kind of wants to like beg the player to use the decisions inside of it. If the game has actual meaningful choices, and the player is used to all these games that do not have meaningful choices, and therefore they're kind of dismissive of the game's build system, you can imagine the game wanting to try kind of too hard to get the player to use like combos in this case, player-made skill macros. I think it's clear that there are too many advantages to using combos in Toram Online, but I think part of the reason for that is that the industry has internalized, with very little of the industry, but the build making industry has internalized the build system part of the industry, that you need to try hard to get players to use build systems because the outside edge of the industry has destroyed a lot of faith in the player that it is worth making a build system. And indeed, I think that is just correct in many cases. It just isn't, like, statistically, if you're playing an unknown game completely random, you probably should assume the build system is just bad and it's to be avoided. But if you're playing a game you tried to pick for a good build system, sure, obviously those can be very good. But it's not obvious to all players why it could be worthwhile. As with all things, the rewards are pretty huge, but you do have to pay the cost before there's any benefit, and humans are surprisingly bad at seeing the benefits of these things. Now, if you want to hear more about the insanity that's coming, EyePatchNotes, you added a video link to this parlay, and I assume you would be happy with me linking that in the description. I found it helpful, though it does cover a lot of the same content. So if you want to listen to that, it's in the description. It's 9 minutes long or so. I thought it was an interesting explanation of this in-game, and there were some points I missed in your description here. But I will continue summarizing from here, because we have to get into the proration thing. Why are there all these little systems, though? Yes, the game is maybe overly baiting the player to be interested in, like, making a build decision instead of just hitting buttons. Build a combo, it'll be fun, and we'll give you, like, a lot of rewards for doing that. Okay, but why are there all these weird little systems for things? Though the obvious answer is, well, it makes it so it's possible to have 4 different skills that reduce the mana cost of the next skill in the same game that you might actually want to use all of. There are other systems that we covered, like not allowing 2 skills to have the same combo opener, that make it more beneficial to want more skills that reduce the mana cost of the next ability, even if some of them are kind of worse than each other a lot of the time, and like they're just different. But why are there so many differences between them? You don't need this many different things about each skill to be different for it to make sense to do that. Right? There's enough reasons why you'd want an opener like this that you don't really need to add this many differences between them for that to make sense. So why? Well, I think one of the reasons is this concept that when you make a build in a game, it's kind of fun to have the game sort of put you in a corner on one hand. There's an opportunity cost to using the really good, have the mana cost of the next skill. So you kind of want to try using this other one so you don't use that good one up. But then on the other hand, there are consequences to putting the player in that corner. There are some factors in the game, differences between the skills, that make you want to use one skill over the other. But then when you've picked that skill, it itself has imposed consequences that make you want to pick other skills over other skills when you get to the next decision point. And so that's why having, I would say proration is the obvious one here, where going so crazy on a system like proration makes sense when you explain it that way. If the game is all about combos, then having it be that the first thing you pick using some interesting opportunity cost, your decision actually matters because you lose something, it's a trade-off. And then having it be that that trade-off you made imposes a new opportunity cost on the next skill makes sense in a game that is begging you to use combos, if that makes sense. And here's what we mean by this. The reveal is here. In this game, a skill does not necessarily inflict the proration type that is the damage type it inflicts. EyePatchNotes says, I tried and failed to use specific terminology for how Toram calculates damage via proration, but here's a cheat sheet. To summarize, every skill in Toram Online has at least 3 separate values. The type of damage the skill counts as doing, that is what it's calculated as against the enemy's, let's say, defense. The type of damage the skill inflicts as proration, which might be different. In other words, a skill that inflicts normal attack damage might inflict magic proration. That's weird, but they allow you to do that. And, even more troubling, there's also the type of damage that the skill calculates as if it is using. That is, a skill can do normal attack damage, inflict magic damage proration, but its damage can use physical proration. Which, yeah, so let's say the enemy has high physical defense. You could heavily prime the enemy so that physical damage will do a lot of damage to them. This seems weird because the enemy has high physical defense. But because a skill can exist, which does normal attack damage, that is, it ignores the enemy's physical defense because it's not physical damage, but uses physical proration, it acts as if it's physical damage, but only for the proration mechanic. You can potentially take advantage of both of those things at once, which I'll be blunt, that's insane, and I think you're insane for designing that, game designers. That is way too subtle of a distinction. And here's the big kicker, to not explain in the video game. That's actually deranged. Don't do that. If you try to test what damage skills do in this game, screw you. Not even for me. This is just the developers. I'm just saying it for them, for you. Forget about it, get bent, is what the designers say. So, yeah, that's too much. I understand why they made the proration system, and I only sort of understand why they made this. Now, understand, the reason that I explained all this parlay up to this point this way is because I want you to leave this parlay feeling like you understand, there is a point in air quotes to making the system this granular, to making it be that a skill inflicts, uses, and then deals 3 extremely intensely synonym close words, very, very similar words. There is a point to doing that. It increases the design space in the game. You can make skills have different benefits in ways you couldn't have before, and make it so 2 skills that inflict physical proration, one of them might do normal attack damage, and that could matter a lot in this game. The game is built around that type of thing mattering. It does genuinely affect the game a lot. A skill could become much stronger by changing one of these granular qualities, and it does fit the game's goals. It encourages the player to make combos, because this mostly matters in the context of what you used around it. And it does increase design space using a mechanic the game already has, but it's just so convoluted that I personally feel like doing it any other way would have been better. I just don't want to come across as saying, this is pointless, why would you do this? No, it's obvious what the benefit is. I'm just saying it's really confusing to understand how it works. Understanding the game design benefit is obvious from the right perspective, and that's what I hope is clear to you. So, you can imagine how these different skills would give different benefits, even though they're these ultra specific things. And it even helps that EyePatchNotes has added examples. Here we go. Number 1, the damage type that the skill inflicts. The proration it inflicts. This skill is treated as the specific type only for increasing the enemy's damage coefficient for the 2 opposing types for proration. For example, Sword Tempest inflicts magic proration, meaning the enemy will take more damage from normal attacks and skills that use physical proration. Number 2, uses. Of the 3 proration types, which single one is included in the damage calculation? Which one in damage calculation for proration only does the skill behave as if it is? Skills most often use physical proration. The most obvious exception is the magic tree. For example, Sword Tempest uses physical proration. Yes, a few skills can inflict one proration type but use another. And then 3, deals. Lastly, does the skill hit the enemy's defense, physical defense, or MDef, magic defense? Notably, there are 3 proration types, but only 2 damage types. That makes me want to die, but okay. Physical is once again the safe assumption. For example, Sword Tempest deals physical damage based on the user's attack, and then is affected by the enemy's defense. And the way to think of this is uses is the type of proration, the player-inflicted vulnerability that the skill uses. Deals is the enemy-owned defense type that this skill interacts with, and inflicts is the player-inflicted damage type the skill causes against the enemy for future hits. I explained that sort of jankily, but there's like your way you're making the enemy more vulnerable, the way the enemy is defending themselves or more vulnerable, and then there's the vulnerability of yours that you add for future use from the skill. 3 separate things. And you could imagine there are skills that when they hit, they reduce the enemy's defense. So that would be a 4th thing that would complete the pattern. Along with inflicts, what type of proration do you inflict? A skill that lowers defense would lower, let's say, defense. And then there's uses, what type of proration does the skill behave with? And deals, what type of enemy defense does the skill behave with? It's basically just a clone of the idea of attack and defense, but on the player's side, sort of. Again, the problem is that it decays over time as well. Unlike if you buff your attack, you don't like lose attack every time, but you do lose the benefit of proration. Okay. Putting all this together, sprinkling in the premise that the blade tree only incentivizes physical damage, Sword Tempest has a bizarre spread. It uses the stats a blader would want anyway, but inflicts magic proration. A player could only use Sword Tempest, and the game would reply, yep, not seeing any reason to decrease this physical damage, which is strange. Like, that is bizarre. There are lots of moments in this game where you would do something or spam something and go, okay, the rules told me that I lose damage over time if I spam the same. Wait, why isn't it going down? Because if a skill inflicts proration, which is different from the damage type it deals, and uses was that one, but also deals, then if you spam it, you won't be reducing its damage because you aren't inflicting the proration type that it actually uses. Okay, now they work a little bit better. That's extremely weird because for other skills in this game, as long as inflict, use, and deals are basically the same, inflict and use are the same, your physical skill spam will lose damage and it will increase, magic and normal attack damage. But if inflict and use are different, then it might not. It might even increase its own damage. That is less clear to me. Okay, I briefly want to unpack the, there are 3 proration types, but 2 defense types. Fuck off, developers, like, what are you doing? Is what I would like to say. But the whole point of this video is to analyze the game's design. So why would you do this? Right? And ... I got nothing, man. It does mean that normal attack is a type where you can focus on only your proration. So I guess a benefit is that if you have 2 different layers, player-owned and basically enemy-owned defense layers, having a type of damage which ignores the enemy-owned layer and only cares about the player-owned layer, normal attacks, which it seems to me don't have an enemy-owned defense type, but do still use the proration mechanics normally. you can kind of focus on proration more with that type of damage, and maybe that's useful in some way, where you don't have to worry about multiple vectors of your damage being reduced. There could be something where, an enemy having high physical defense but low magic defense means you just want to spam magic attacks. But if you use physical attacks, which the game wants you to do to prorate your magic damage to make it higher, well, they'll do bad damage. So now you want to use normal attacks to prorate your magic damage, because there is no normal attack defense, if I'm understanding correctly. You could say that's why it makes sense. And then eventually the game does the decision runway thing again, where it says, okay, well, you've now prorated normal and magic damage. Will you now use a physical attack, even though the damage will be ass? And the player might go, maybe. I won't just pretend those don't exist simply because I'm fighting an enemy with high defense. I feel like it's not the end of the world if the player just did consider those not to exist. Sometimes it's not that bad, but perhaps that is why. You see what I mean? Is this really necessary, though? Another way to look at it is that if you create weaknesses in the enemy using proration, and then the enemy is trying to manipulate what damage you want to do using its own defenses, you could argue that having a normal attack defense is kind of redundant. If the enemy has low defense or magic defense, you might want to use that one. If you balance normal attack damage attacks to do slightly lower damage, unless the enemy has high magic and physical defense, then that creates a triangle without you needing an additional stat, I guess. And it also offers something that is a little less fussy, a generalist option, sort of, as opposed to more specific or specialist options from physical and magic defense, and attacks that pierce or lower those. Sure, I guess. The reason I feel kind of is that you would basically never want to only use one type of damage in this game. So a generalist option is kind of weird, right? It's generally good. It's always good to enable the damage of your other skills, right? And even if the enemy had low physical defense and low magic defense, you can imagine that depending on how these skills are balanced, you might just still want to use normal attacks to prorate your physical and magic damage. So, I guess that's what they're for. And that's why the enemy doesn't have resistance to them. You could just make them weaker unilaterally. But I feel like they're not even generalist as much as you just do use these to prime your other skills. I would be interested to hear what you think about that, EyePatchNotes, having played a lot of this. But to me, it seems like, what is the point of this exactly? I guess it makes sense, but it doesn't really. I feel like in some ways the pattern of there being normal attack defense would be actually easier to understand than, yes, technically if you don't have normal attack defense, there's one less stat, but it's all slightly misaligned. You know what I mean? There's no third stat for normal attack damage. Physical and normal attack is still somewhat breaking my brain, but I've been 90% consistent in this parlay. Okay. Having gone through that experience, I love this parlay. I don't know if you can tell. It's interesting because you can see how there's a clear benefit, and yet a trade-off has been made. This seems to me from the outside like a very inelegant system, and it's also very unintuitive, but it is very, let's use the term on task. There's a very, very clear, I feel obvious once you analyze it, reason for every single design decision. And let's also say well balanced, where here, having not played the game, I basically just mean they clearly thought about balance as they thought about the benefits of balance, really, as they were making these skills. If you're going to have 4 different skills, obviously there ought to be reasons to use one over the other. They clearly thought about that when they made them. Cool. But this creates a sort of at least 4 qualities for what are your goals when you make this type of system. So the first one would be you want enough design space, basically. I guess that's a 5th one. But okay, it's focused on making a lot of design space. Good. The second one is a balance, or acknowledging the benefit of balance. So this is, are there pros and cons to using these different skills? Or if some of them are just better than others, does the game make it meaningful for the others to exist despite that being true? And the answer is yes to both in this case, as we talked about earlier. Is there a logical game design need? I guess this is kind of similar to design space. Did they just add a bunch of mechanics for no reason, or does it seem to be a clear desire to keep the game as simple as possible while fulfilling these other goals the way the designers thought was good? Yeah, I guess. Even though this system is complicated, a thing it does not do is blatantly add new things that seem fully redundant with other things, as far as I can tell. It might feel that way, but having your own system where you manipulate the damage you deal with proration is distinct from the enemies having defenses, though if there's enough abilities in this game that reduce enemy defenses, that does feel like a bit similar. And I'm pretty sure there are going to be abilities that do that. That does feel a little similar, but let's just say passing grade for this one, C plus. Good effort. I feel like you could probably figure out a better way to do it. But really the problem is more those other two qualities. Does the game construct things in a way that has the psychological goal of being understandable, intuitive to the player? I would say no, 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 no. It seems like this game, not 1 out of 10, but like 2 or 3 out of 10. Bad. Not as bad as it could be, but not good. This game doesn't usually say on its skills which of these qualities the skills have. If the skill inflicts a different proration type than it uses or deals, damage type or whatever, it does not often say. Sometimes it does. A lot of the time it appears that it doesn't. So that's bad. Having there be like not clear terms for these, or like if these are the official terms, those are way too similar. Inflicts, uses, and deals, again, like get out of here. If those are actually the official terms, that's very bad. But they might be translated, to be fair. But that's still really bad. The translation team's job is to, anyway, that's not good. You could word or represent these almost any way, or almost any way different from how they're currently represented, and that would almost certainly add clarity. Again, I'm not talking about actually changing the mechanics, but just presenting them in a way that would be more clear to the player. And then I would say there's the elegance quality. This is actually changing the mechanics to make them clearer to the player. This is where we say something like, is the benefit of this big enough that it's worth the big amount of confusion that it inflicts upon the player's psyche? And I would say, I don't know about that. Maybe. I'm not trying to be facetious. Maybe. I don't know. I don't know. I do want to be critical and say I don't think you would make this system this way if you cared about that. I highly doubt this is what would come out if that was what you were worried about. But practically nowhere in the entire game industry prioritizes like good documentation or clarity in descriptions. So I want to be careful with this point. Critiquing the developer, if that's what we're doing here, or just analyzing the game's build system for these qualities, we need to be careful to note that there is a sort of grading on a curve phenomenon that is worth doing for looking at the industry as a whole. Can I think of practically any games that explain these things well? Yeah, but like it's kind of troubling how I can sort of count them, on one hand. So yeah, no, not really. It's not a good justification for not explaining how the things work to say, oh, we just don't do, that's just not done currently, but you can just look it up. Like, no, that means nothing. I'm just saying that is probably why they didn't include that. You see what I'm trying to say? I don't want to act like, oh, they spite the player understanding. Probably not. They're probably just being a bit of a follower about how the industry doesn't like prioritize doing this. If every single game outlet was screaming from the rooftops to include what the abilities do in the video game, you can imagine there would be a much higher choice that they would just add it. And there are even cases where the industry is worried that the player will be put off by giving them the information. I think that is sort of silly and not really supported by the evidence, but that definitely is a thing some publishers at least worry about, that if the game looks like it's full of numbers, that will seem inelegant and complicated to the player and they'll just bounce off it. That's very unintellectual of them, but people are very unintellectual, so it's not like a totally unjustified concern. I just feel like it's not worth, like, you don't need to make a video game either, to be blunt, right? There's no need to make this video game, so you should make it good. And if you say, well, they have to make money, yeah, it's easier to make money almost any way other than making video games. So if you didn't want to make it this way, I feel like, is there that much of a point, really? And the biggest thing for me is that many of these systems that have all these relatively involved, actually kind of elegant in a way when you understand them fully, but relatively involved build systems, there's no way that players that are going to be put off by a little bit of data added to explain what it does are going to enjoy this game, right? I think that's the bigger point. If you can see my point, a player confronted with all these different combo options and tags and the sequencing of abilities and the proration system such that they would maybe enjoy the game is not going to be then put off by you telling them how all of that works. And a player that would be put off by telling you how all of that works wouldn't have been able to accept this game before they were told that information. They would do terrible damage all the time. They would try to understand why. They would run into a wall of confusion about proration. The game doesn't help them, and they would stop playing the game. I think that's fairly clear. Game developers, I feel like you are somewhat to blame here. Like, I feel like it's kind of hand wavy to just say, oh, what if that's a concern of the player? You could totally playtest this. Hire a psychologist and watch the players in the room. These games with like millions of dollar budgets, I have no sympathy. Hire one person to think about this. In my spare time, I could get my friends to play games like this and get some usable data. That's not perfect. It's not very scientific, but it would be more than most games actually do. And I don't cost a damn thing. Well, specifically, I cost around $9. That's what I've got for this parlay. And if you'd like to submit your own, I have a link in the description you can follow where you can pay me money to rent some of my brain space for a month to chew on a subject that you find interesting. I hope my evaluation of this one was interesting, EyePatchNotes. I thought it was a fun way to break it down, that there are a lot of trade-offs to making this system this way. And to be charitable for a minute, I feel like a lot of the things that are bad about this way of doing it are things that almost every game in the entire industry does badly. And then the good things are, it has some benefits if you understand it. Okay, good. Like, that's good. Genuinely, I think that's great. And at the end of the day, not understanding it, while you should, and it is worth doing a lot of work to make that easier, that is still something where if the player can get over that hump, it doesn't really matter anymore. You know, once you understand it, you just do understand it. This is an argument indirectly, and we could do a parlay about this, for games being long, for just making the game longer. If the player needs to get over the hump of understanding this contrived system, as long as they get to use that knowledge for a while, maybe that could be a little more worth it. I am a little allergic to this thing where people begin like a really long book and they're willing to be patient for like 100 pages for the book to get good, because they say, well, it's a really big book. Like, you need some time for setup. You do not need some time for setup. I have read, and you can make basically every story ever told by humanity get good within the first few pages. You absolutely do not need to just abandon those pages being interesting to exposition dump. However, that's not to say it's easy. And so sure, I think that some players are more willing to saddle up for whatever attempt at that the developer ought to still put a lot of effort into. Yeah, if there will be a lot of game afterward. And the fact that players as a whole, or humanity as a whole right now, to me, feels a little allergic to like longer entertainment, feels like it is competing. It's a bit at odds with this type of system, which otherwise I feel like is a kind of solid value proposition. This sounds cool. I will just leave you with the thought that this is yet another on the long pile of games we've talked about in the series that are like, if you just edited this slightly, like one guy with a few simple placeholder assets typing text into the game could make this so much clearer with like 1 week of spare time. It's kind of a great thing in a way, but a painful thing for a game to have done poorly, because you could change it really easily for very little development budget, and it would be a huge benefit to do that. So I won't shout that from the rooftops anymore. I mean, of course I will every single time, but I'm done now. Okay. Looking forward to the next one. Bye-bye.